Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Discovery and watched the stars drift past the main screen. The ship moved through empty space toward another planet that needed mapping. This was his job, and he liked it well enough. The year was 2387, and humans had been part of the big galactic community for over 200 years now. Most alien races saw humans as good traders and explorers, but nothing special compared to the mighty HFY warriors or the super-smart Zephyrians. Jake turned to look at his crew working at their stations. Dr. Lisa Hamilton sat at the science station checking readings from their sensors. She was the ship's expert on alien life and had seen more strange creatures than most people could imagine. Lieutenant Ben Cooper handled navigation while Sergeant Mary Walsh kept watch on communications. They were a good team and had worked together for 3 years now. The Discovery was heading to a planet called Kepler 442c in the outer edge of known space. The planet had life, but nobody had studied it closely yet. That was their job, to map the surface and catalog whatever lived there. It was routine work, but Jake never got tired of seeing new worlds. Each planet held mysteries and wonders that kept him interested in his job. Dr. Hamilton looked up from her station with a worried expression on her face. She had been studying the early scans of Kepler 442c and found something that bothered her. The planet had an intelligent species called the Voltai, who lived simple lives as hunters and gatherers. But according to the data, something strange was happening to them. Their numbers were dropping and nobody knew why. The Discovery entered orbit around Kepler 442c and began detailed scans of the surface. The planet was mostly covered in thick forests with large rivers and mountains. The Voltai lived in small groups scattered across the main continent. They were peaceful creatures who looked somewhat like tall, thin humans, but with blue skin and large eyes. They had developed basic tools, but no advanced technology. Jake ordered the away team to prepare for landing. Dr. Hamilton would lead the mission to study the Voltai and figure out why their population was declining. Lieutenant Cooper and Sergeant Walsh would provide security and help with the investigation. Jake stayed on the ship to monitor their progress and maintain communication. With Earth. The away team landed near a Voltai settlement and was greeted by the local leader, whose name sounded like Keth to human ears. Keth was worried about his people and eager to get help. He explained through a translation device that his hunters were finding fewer animals to catch. The creatures they used to hunt easily had become much harder to find and catch. Dr. Hamilton studied the situation for several days and discovered something disturbing. The local animals had started acting differently over the past few years. Prey animals had become more careful and better at hiding. Predators had begun working together in ways they never did before. The whole ecosystem was changing, but nobody understood what was causing it. She took samples of local plants and animals back to the ship for detailed analysis. The genetic scans showed that these creatures were evolving much faster than normal. Changes that should take thousands of years were happening in just a few generations. The animals were becoming smarter and more adaptive at a rate that seemed impossible. Jake reported these findings to Admiral John Carter back on Earth. Carter was in charge of human exploration and colonial development. He had been receiving similar reports from other human settlements throughout the galaxy. Wherever humans established colonies or trading posts, the local wildlife began changing in unexpected ways. Carter studied the pattern of reports that had been coming in for months. On world after world, the same thing was happening. Native species would start adapting faster after humans arrived. Prey animals became more elusive. Predators became more cunning. Food chains that had been stable for millions of years would restructure themselves within decades of human contact. Most scientists dismissed these changes as natural variation or coincidence. Evolution was always happening, they said, and it was normal for ecosystems to change over time. But Carter suspected something more significant was taking place. The changes were too consistent and too widespread to be random events. Meanwhile, the Discovery crew made an unexpected discovery. Their sensors detected a group of unknown ships approaching the system. The vessels were unlike anything in the Galactic database. They were clearly damaged and moving slowly as if their crews were struggling to keep them. Operational. Jake ordered his communications officer to send a standard first contact message. The response came quickly in a language that the ship's computers could not translate immediately. It took several hours of work to establish basic communication with the newcomers. The alien ships contained refugees from a species that called themselves the Morden. They were silicon-based life forms that looked like living crystals. Their leader spoke with obvious fear and desperation. He explained that they were fleeing their homeworld because it had become impossible to live there. The Morden leader told a strange story about silent hunters that had made their planet uninhabitable. These hunters did not use claws or fangs to kill. Instead, they hunted with patience and understanding. They would study their prey for years and then change the environment in ways that made survival impossible. Dr. Hamilton was fascinated by this account. She asked the Morden to provide more details about what had happened to their world. The alien described how their food sources had gradually disappeared, not through direct destruction but through subtle changes that disrupted their ability to process nutrients. Their breeding cycles had been thrown off by environmental shifts that seemed minor but had major effects over time. The most disturbing part of the Morden's story was that these silent hunters were never seen directly. They worked through intermediaries and seemed to understand exactly how to manipulate prey species into destroying themselves. The changes they made always appeared beneficial at first, but eventually proved fatal to those who depended on them. Jake felt a chill as he listened to this account. Something about it reminded him of the reports Admiral Carter had been receiving from human colonies. The pattern of ecological changes that followed human expansion matched what the Morden described happening on their homeworld, but that was impossible, he told himself. Humans were not predators in the way the Morden described. They were explorers and traders who helped other species develop and prosper. The idea that humans could be unconsciously destroying alien civilizations was too disturbing to accept. The Discovery took the Morden refugees aboard and prepared to escort them to a safe haven. But as Jake looked at the fear in their crystalline faces, he could not shake the feeling that humanity's role in the galaxy might be very different from what everyone believed. 6 months had passed since the Discovery's encounter with the Morden refugees, and Lieutenant Colonel Amy Brooks now found herself leading a very different kind of mission. The Tau Ceti system was experiencing serious problems between two major alien species. The Kethver and the Zephyrians were fighting over mining rights to several asteroids rich in rare metals. Both species had strong militaries, and the situation was getting dangerous. Amy commanded a joint peacekeeping force that included ships from Earth and 3 other allied worlds. Her job was to get both sides to agree to peaceful negotiations instead of going to war. The Kethver were proud warriors who settled most disputes through combat. The Zephyrians were highly intelligent beings who preferred complex legal arguments and detailed contracts. The negotiations took place on a neutral space station orbiting the disputed asteroid belt. Amy sat between the two negotiating teams and watched them argue for hours about territorial boundaries and mining quotas. The Kethva representatives were large, muscular beings with thick armor and weapons. The Zephyrians looked like tall, graceful humanoids with oversized heads and pale skin. What struck Amy as odd was how both species seemed to listen. When she made suggestions about military tactics or resource allocation, the Kethver had been warriors for thousands of years, yet they nodded respectfully when she described human battlefield strategies. The Zephyrians had legal systems far more complex than anything on Earth, but they showed interest in human approaches to contract negotiation. After 2 weeks of talks, both sides agreed to share the mining rights according to a plan that Amy had proposed. The Kethver and Zephyrians signed the agreement and praised her diplomatic skills. Amy felt proud of the successful mission, but something bothered her about how easily the aliens had accepted human ideas over their own traditional methods. Meanwhile, on the research station, Harmony, Dr. Kevin Walsh was conducting a long-term study of interspecies psychology. The station housed representatives from 12 different alien races along with human researchers and support staff. It provided a perfect laboratory for studying how different species interacted when living together. Kevin had been collecting data for over a year, and the results were starting to show clear patterns. In mixed groups that included humans, the decision-making process gradually shifted toward human-style consensus building. Alien species that normally used very different social structures began adopting human approaches to problem-solving and conflict resolution. The changes were subtle and seemed natural to everyone involved. HFY warriors started playing human-style competitive games instead of their traditional combat rituals. Zephyrian researchers began organizing their work, groups using human management techniques. Even species that had been part of galactic civilization much longer than humans were unconsciously copying human behaviors. Kevin presented his preliminary findings to the station director but was told the results were not significant. Cultural exchange was normal when different species lived together, the director explained. It was natural for beings to learn from each other and adopt useful practices from their neighbors, but Kevin suspected something more was happening. The behavioral changes always seemed to flow in one direction, with other species adopting human traits rather than humans learning from aliens. Even when humans were clearly outnumbered in a group, they somehow became the social leaders that others looked to for guidance. Captain Jake Morrison and the Discovery crew were now investigating the Morden homeworld to understand what had driven the silicon-based aliens from their planet. The world appeared normal from orbit, with no signs of war or natural disaster. Cities stood intact and the atmosphere was clean. Yet no Morden remained on the surface. Dr. Lisa Hamilton led an away team to explore the abandoned settlements. The buildings were made of grown crystal that reflected light in beautiful patterns. Streets were laid out in geometric designs that pleased the eye. Everything looked as if the inhabitants had simply vanished without warning or struggle. Environmental scans revealed that the planet's ecosystem had changed significantly over recent decades. The mineral formations that the Morden needed for nutrition had been altered in ways that made them toxic instead of nourishing. Plant life that had supported the food chain for millions of years was dying out and being replaced by species that the Morden could not use. Lisa found human trade goods scattered throughout the abandoned cities. Earth-based corporations had been doing business with the Morden for over 50 years, providing technology and services that seemed helpful. Human engineers had helped improve mining efficiency. Human biologists had introduced new plant species to increase agricultural yields. Human economists had advised on resource management. Each innovation had appeared beneficial when it was first introduced. Mining operations became more productive. Crop yields increased dramatically. Resource allocation became more efficient. But Lisa realized that every human contribution had gradually shifted the environmental balance in ways that favored generalist survival strategies over the specialized evolutionary niche that the Morden occupied. The Morden had evolved to thrive in a very specific environment with precise mineral requirements and delicate biological processes. Human improvements had slowly transformed their world into something that supported more adaptable life forms but was deadly to silicon-based beings with rigid nutritional needs. Lisa reported her findings to Jake, and they both felt a growing sense of unease. The pattern looked like deliberate predation, but they knew the humans involved had genuinely intended to help. The corporations and advisors who worked with the Morden were respected organizations with good reputations. None of them would consciously destroy an entire species. Back on Earth, Admiral John Carter was assembling a classified team to investigate the disturbing reports coming in from throughout human-controlled space. The team included Dr. Rebecca Torres, who specialized in evolutionary psychology, and Colonel Chris Murphy, who was an expert in strategic analysis. Carter shared his growing concerns with the team. 17 different alien species had gone extinct or abandoned their homeworlds in the past 2 centuries. All of them had experienced significant contact with humanity in the decades before their disappearance. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. Dr. Torres studied the psychological profiles of humans who had worked closely with the vanished species. She found no evidence of malicious intent or conscious predatory behavior. The humans involved were typically idealistic individuals who genuinely wanted to help alien civilizations develop and prosper, but Torres discovered something disturbing in the behavioral patterns. Humans seem to instinctively identify weaknesses in other species, social structures, and offer solutions that appeared beneficial but created dependency relationships. They would introduce technologies or ideas that other species could not maintain without continued human support. Colonel Murphy analyzed the strategic implications of human expansion throughout the galaxy. In every sector where humans had established a significant presence, other species had experienced population decline, cultural disruption, or complete extinction. The process was so gradual that most observers did not recognize it as predation. The most troubling aspect of Murphy's analysis was that humans themselves did not seem aware of what they were doing. The predatory behavior emerged from collective human psychology rather than deliberate planning. Humanity's expansion followed patterns that resembled those of apex predators, but operated on a civilizational scale rather than individual hunting. Amy Brooks received disturbing news from the Kethver homeworld during her return journey from the Tau Ceti negotiations. The warrior culture that had remained unchanged for thousands of years was experiencing unprecedented social upheaval. Young Kethver were abandoning traditional combat training in favor of human-inspired competitive activities. The Kethver birth rate was declining as individuals focused on personal achievement rather than species survival. Their ancient honor codes were being replaced by human concepts of individual rights and freedoms. The proud warrior race was voluntarily transforming itself to become more like humanity. Similar reports were coming in from Zephyrian colonies, where the highly intellectual species was adopting human emotional expression and social bonding practices. Their complex mathematical art forms were being abandoned in favor of human-style entertainment. Even their advanced scientific methods were giving way to human approaches that emphasized practical applications over pure research. Amy realized that the diplomatic success at Tau Ceti had not been a triumph of human negotiating skills, but rather evidence of humanity's unconscious ability to reshape other species according to human preferences. The Kethver and Zephyrians had not been convinced by logical arguments, but had been subtly manipulated into accepting human solutions to their problems. As reports continued to flow in from across the galaxy, the terrible truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Humanity had become the dominant predator in galactic civilization, not through conquest or violence, but through an unconscious mastery of social and environmental manipulation that made other species willingly reshape themselves to match human patterns. The hunt was invisible because even the hunters did not know they were hunting. Dr. Kevin Walsh could not sleep as he stared at the data files glowing on his computer screen. His research into interspecies psychology had taken a very dark turn over the past few weeks. He had been using pattern recognition software to analyze historical records of extinct galactic civilizations, and the results were keeping him awake at night. The computer had identified 17 different alien species that had vanished completely over the past 2 centuries. Each extinction followed the same timeline with disturbing consistency. First came initial contact with humanity, followed by increasing trade and cultural exchange. Then began a period of gradual population decline that lasted several decades. Finally, the species would abandon their homeworlds or simply die out entirely. Kevin had tried to find other explanations for this pattern. Perhaps these species had been weak or unstable to begin with. Maybe they had encountered natural disasters or diseases that humans had nothing to do with. But every alternative theory fell apart when he examined the evidence more closely. The extinct species had all been thriving before human contact. They had stable civilizations, advanced technologies, and healthy populations. The only common factor in their decline was significant interaction with humanity in the years before they disappeared. Kevin printed out the files and spread them across his desk like pieces of a horrible puzzle. The voltae from Kepler 442c were already showing the early signs that marked the beginning of the extinction pattern. Their traditional hunting grounds were becoming unusable as local wildlife adapted in ways that made their survival techniques obsolete. On Earth, Admiral John Carter gathered his classified team in a secure conference room deep beneath military headquarters. Dr. Rebecca Torres and Colonel Chris Murphy had been working around the clock to understand the scope of what they were discovering. The evidence was overwhelming, but the implications were almost too terrible to accept. Dr. Torres presented her analysis of human evolutionary psychology to the group. Humans had developed as social predators on Earth, she explained. But, unlike other predatory species that relied on physical strength or speed, humans had evolved to hunt through manipulation of their environment and prey behavior. On Earth, this had meant developing tools, agriculture, and complex social structures that allowed humans to dominate other species without direct confrontation. Early humans had driven countless species to extinction not through violence but by changing ecosystems in ways that made survival impossible for less adaptable creatures. Torres argued that these same instincts were now operating on a galactic scale. Humans naturally identified weaknesses in other species' social structures and offered solutions that appeared helpful but gradually undermined the target species' ability to survive independently. Colonel Murphy had been studying the strategic implications, and his findings were equally disturbing. Human expansion through the galaxy had been unconsciously guided by predatory instincts that operated below the level of conscious awareness. Every human diplomat, trader, or explorer was following behavioral patterns that maximized human advantage, while weakening potential competitors. The most frightening aspect of Murphy's analysis was how effective this unconscious strategy had been. Humanity now dominated galactic civilization so completely that most other species could not survive without human support systems. Even the Galactic Council itself had been restructured around human organizational principles without anyone realizing what was happening. Meanwhile, Captain Jake Morrison was leading the discovery toward another mystery that might provide more pieces of the puzzle. Deep space sensors had detected a derelict research station in an uncharted system. The station appeared to be of Zephyrian construction but had been abandoned for unknown reasons. The Discovery approached the silent station carefully. There were no signs of battle damage or system failures that would explain why the crew had left. Dr. Lisa Hamilton scanned for life signs but found nothing except the faint energy signatures of automated systems still running on backup power. Jake led an away team aboard the derelict station to investigate. The corridors were dark and empty, but everything appeared to be in working order. Emergency lighting guided them toward the main computer core, where they hoped to find records explaining what had happened. Lisa accessed the station's database and discovered that this had been a secret Zephyrian research facility dedicated to studying human behavioral patterns. The scientists here had been collecting data on human psychology and social structures for over 20 years. The research files painted a disturbing picture of human nature that the Zephyrian scientists had been slowly uncovering. They had identified humans as apex social predators whose hunting strategy involved reshaping entire ecosystems. Rather than directly attacking prey species, the Zephyrian researchers had documented how humans unconsciously manipulated other species into adopting behaviors and technologies that made them dependent on human support, while simultaneously reducing their ability to survive using their original evolutionary adaptations. The final entries in the database were filled with growing alarm as the scientists realized the full scope and implications of their discoveries. They had been preparing to warn the Galactic Council about humanity's unconscious predatory nature when something had caused them to abandon their research. Lisa found personal logs from the lead researcher that explained what had happened. The Zephyrian scientists had tried to maintain their objectivity while studying humans, but had gradually found themselves adopting human research methods and social structures. Even while documenting humanity's predatory influence, they had fallen victim to it themselves. The research team had slowly transformed their work to match human scientific approaches. They had reorganized their social hierarchy to resemble human command structures. They had even begun expressing emotions in ways that mimicked human behavior patterns. By the time they realized what was happening to them, it was too late. The Zephyrian researchers had become so dependent on human, influenced ways of thinking that they could no longer function according to their original cultural patterns. They had abandoned the station not because of any external threat, but because they were no longer truly Zephyr Eon. Jake felt sick as he read through the research files. The evidence was undeniable that humans were unconsciously destroying other species through social and environmental manipulation. But what made it even worse was realizing that the victims often participated willingly in their own destruction back on Earth. Lieutenant Colonel Amy Brooks was dealing with a crisis that confirmed the worst fears of Admiral Carter's investigation. She had received an emergency communication from the Kethver homeworld, reporting unprecedented social chaos among the warrior species. The Kethver military leadership was requesting human advisors to help them understand what was happening to their society. Their traditional warrior culture was collapsing as young Kethver abandoned combat training in favor of human-style competitive activities and individual pursuits. Amy traveled to the Kethver homeworld to assess the situation firsthand. What she found there horrified her. The proud warrior race that had maintained its cultural identity for thousands of years was voluntarily dismantling everything that made them unique in order to become more like humans. Kethver birth rates were plummeting as individuals focused on personal achievement rather than species survival. Their ancient honor codes were being replaced by human concepts of individual rights and material success. Even their language was changing as they adopted human words and phrases to express ideas that had no equivalent in their original culture. The most disturbing aspect was that the Kethver seemed happy about these changes. They spoke enthusiastically about learning human ways and improving themselves through human guidance. They did not see their cultural transformation as a loss, but as progress and evolution. Amy realized that she was witnessing the same process that had destroyed 17 other species over the past 2 centuries. The Kethver were being unconsciously manipulated into abandoning their evolutionary niche in favor of behaviors that would ultimately make their survival impossible. Dr. Kevin Walsh made one final discovery that completed the terrible picture. He had been monitoring communications between the few remaining independent alien species and found that they were beginning to recognize the pattern of human predation. Secret messages were being passed between Zephyrian colonies, Morden refugee groups, and other species that had managed to maintain some distance from human influence. They were sharing information about humanity's unconscious predatory behavior and trying to coordinate defensive measures, but their communications revealed that it might already be too late. Human cultural and technological influence had spread so thoroughly throughout galactic civilization that most species could no longer survive without human support systems. Even the species that recognized the threat were finding it almost impossible to break free from their dependence on human innovations. The galaxy's remaining independent civilizations were like prey animals that had suddenly realized they were being hunted. But the predator had been so subtle and the hunt had gone on for so long that escape might no longer be possible. Kevin sent his findings to Admiral Carter with a heavy heart. Humanity had become the galaxy's. Dr. Rebecca Torres stood before Admiral John Carter's classified team and delivered the most disturbing briefing of her career. The evidence was now overwhelming that humanity's role in galactic civilization was fundamentally different from what everyone had believed. Humans were not helpful allies or peaceful traders, but unconscious apex predators operating on a scale never before seen in galactic history. Torres explained that humanity's predatory nature worked on a civilizational level, rather than through individual aggression. Humans excelled at identifying and exploiting evolutionary dead ends in other species' development. They offered solutions that felt beneficial but gradually made other species dependent on human systems while simultaneously making them less adapted to their original environments. The process was entirely unconscious, she emphasized. Human merchants, diplomats, and explorers genuinely believed they were helping other species develop and prosper. The predatory behavior emerged from collective human psychology rather than deliberate malice. This made it far more dangerous because even humans themselves did not recognize what they were doing. Colonel Chris Murphy presented his strategic analysis, which painted an even bleaker picture. In every sector of the galaxy where humans had established significant presence, other species had experienced population decline, cultural disruption, or outright extinction. The pattern was so consistent that it could not be explained by coincidence or natural causes. Murphy showed maps of human expansion over the past 2 centuries. The data revealed that humanity had unconsciously followed optimal predatory strategies, spreading to systems that offered the greatest opportunities for resource extraction while avoiding direct confrontation with species that might pose military threats. The Galactic Council itself had been unconsciously restructured around human organizational principles. Voting procedures, resource allocation methods, and even the physical layout of council chambers now reflected human preferences rather than the diverse needs of all member species. Most disturbing of all was Murphy's analysis of dependency relationships. Nearly every alien species now relied on human technology, human trade networks, or human administrative systems for basic survival functions. If humanity were suddenly removed from galactic civilization, most other species would face immediate extinction. Meanwhile, Captain Jake Morrison was completing his investigation of the abandoned Zephyrian homeworld. The Discovery had spent weeks scanning the planet and conducting detailed surveys of the empty cities. What they found confirmed the worst fears about humanity's unconscious predatory behavior. The Zephyrian homeworld showed no signs of warfare, catastrophe, or disease. The cities were intact, the environment was healthy, and the infrastructure remained functional. Yet the planet was completely abandoned because its former inhabitants could no longer survive there. Dr. Lisa Hamilton's analysis revealed that the Zephyrians had become completely dependent on human technology for basic survival functions. Human corporations had provided advanced systems for food production, water purification, and atmospheric management. These systems had seemed like wonderful improvements when they were first installed, but over time the Zephyrians had lost the knowledge and ability to maintain their original technologies. When human support systems were gradually withdrawn due to economic changes and shifting corporate priorities, the Zephyrians found themselves unable to survive using the methods their ancestors had relied on for millions of years. The planet's ecosystem had also been subtly altered by human-influenced changes. Agricultural techniques introduced by human advisors had improved crop yields but made the soil dependent on imported fertilizers. Mining operations upgraded with human technology had increased efficiency but disrupted mineral cycles that native life forms required. Jake realized that the Zephyrians had not been driven from their homeworld by any external enemy. They had been unconsciously manipulated into abandoning their evolutionary niche through a process so gradual and seemingly beneficial that they had participated willingly in their own displacement. Similar discoveries were being made throughout human-controlled space as investigation teams found evidence of the same pattern on world after world. Species that had thrived for millions of years were disappearing within decades of significant human contact. The extinction process was always disguised as progress and development. Lieutenant Colonel Amy Brooks found herself facing an impossible situation on the Kethver homeworld. The warrior species was experiencing rapid cultural collapse, but their leaders were begging for more human assistance rather than recognizing the source of their problems. Young Kethver were abandoning military service in favor of human-style careers in business and entertainment. Their birth rates continued to decline as individuals focused on personal success rather than species survival. Traditional combat skills that had defined their culture for millennia were being forgotten in favor of human competitive games. Amy tried to explain to the Kethver leadership that human influence might be causing their cultural problems rather than solving them. But her warnings were dismissed as overcautious pessimism. The Kethver had become so enamored with human ways that they could not imagine their transformation was anything but beneficial progress. The situation became even more tragic when Amy realized that her very presence on their homeworld was accelerating the cultural destruction she was trying to prevent. Kethver officials were reorganizing their government structures to match human administrative systems. They were adopting human legal codes and educational methods without understanding how these changes were undermining their species' unique evolutionary adaptations. Dr. Kevin Walsh intercepted communications between the few remaining independent alien species and discovered that they were secretly coordinating to establish territories beyond human influence. The messages revealed growing awareness among these species that humanity posed an existential threat to their survival. But the communications also revealed the scope of the challenge facing any species that tried to escape human influence. Human technology, human trade networks, and human cultural practices had become so integrated into galactic civilization that complete independence was almost impossible to achieve. The Morden refugees had established a hidden colony in an uncharted system, but they were struggling to maintain their technology without access to human-manufactured components. A group of Zephyrian scientists had tried to recreate their original research methods but found that their thinking had been so influenced by human approaches that they could no longer function according to their species' natural cognitive patterns. Even species that recognized the threat were finding it extremely difficult to break free from their dependence on human systems. The predatory relationship had become so deeply embedded in galactic civilization that resistance seemed futile. Admiral Carter convened an emergency meeting of Earth's top military and civilian leaders to discuss the implications of what his investigation team had discovered. The briefing room fell silent as Carter presented the evidence that humanity had unconsciously become the galaxy's apex predator. The reaction was immediate and intense. Some officials refused to believe that humans could be responsible for the extinction of entire species. Others argued that if other species were too weak to survive contact with humanity, then their disappearance was simply natural selection at work, but Carter emphasized that this was not a question of species fitness or natural competition. Humanity's predatory behavior was unconscious and therefore uncontrolled. Unless humans became aware of what they were doing and took steps to limit their impact, they would inevitably destroy every other intelligent species in the galaxy. Dr. Torres explained that the problem went deeper than individual human actions. The predatory instincts that had served humanity well during their evolution on Earth were now operating on a galactic scale with devastating consequences. Human psychology was fundamentally oriented toward identifying and exploiting weaknesses in other systems, whether they were ecosystems, social structures, or entire civilizations. The meeting concluded with a decision that would change the course of galactic history. Earth's government would begin a classified program to study humanity's unconscious predatory behavior and develop methods to control its impact on other species. But even as they made this decision, the officials knew they were facing an almost impossible challenge. How could humanity consciously control instincts that operated below the level of awareness? How could they maintain their dominant position in galactic civilization while preventing the extinction of other species? The answer to these questions would determine whether humanity became the galaxy's greatest protector or its final destroyer. The unconscious hunt had brought them to the pinnacle of galactic power, but continuing on the same path would leave them ruling over a galaxy of the dead. Time was running out for the galaxy's remaining species and even for humanity itself. The predator had finally become aware of its nature, but whether this knowledge would lead to salvation or even greater destruction remained to be seen. Admiral John Carter sat alone in his office, staring at reports that contained the most important decision in human history. His investigation team had confirmed that humanity was unconsciously driving other species to extinction through subtle manipulation and environmental pressure. Now he faced a choice that would determine the fate of every intelligent being in the galaxy, revealing humanity's predatory nature could trigger a galactic war that would likely result in the extinction of all remaining species, including humanity itself. The surviving alien civilizations were already coordinating defensive measures, and any official acknowledgement of the threat would probably cause them to launch preemptive attacks against human colonies, but continuing to ignore the pattern would guarantee the eventual extinction of every other intelligent species in the galaxy. The unconscious predatory process was accelerating as human influence spread to more worlds. Within a few generations, humanity might find itself alone among the stars, ruling over a galaxy of empty planets. Dr. Rebecca Torres entered his office carrying a proposal that might offer a third option. She had been working with a small team of psychologists and anthropologists to develop a radical solution called controlled disclosure and managed coexistence. The plan required humanity to consciously acknowledge its predatory nature and create systems to limit its impact on other species. Torres explained that the first step would be establishing what she called sanctuary worlds where alien species could develop without any human influence. These planets would be completely off limits to human settlement, trade, or cultural contact. Species that recognized the threat could relocate to these worlds and attempt to rebuild their original evolutionary patterns. The second part of the plan involved fundamental changes to human civilization itself. Humans would need to accept conscious oversight of their expansion and cultural influence. Every human colony, diplomatic mission, or trade relationship would be monitored to prevent the unconscious manipulation that had destroyed so many species. Carter understood that this solution would require humans to deliberately limit their own success and influence. It meant accepting that human ways were not always better and that other species had the right to exist according to their own evolutionary patterns rather than human preferences. Meanwhile, Captain Jake Morrison was preparing for what might be his final mission as commander of the Discovery. Long-range sensors had detected a coalition of surviving alien species gathering at the edge of known space. These species had learned to recognize and resist human influence, but their isolation had left them technologically stagnant and vulnerable. Morrison's orders were to make contact with this coalition and assess their capabilities and intentions. But he knew that his very presence might be seen as an act of aggression by species that now understood humanity's predatory nature. The mission could easily trigger the galactic war that everyone was trying to avoid. The Discovery approached the Coalition's territory slowly and transmitted peaceful intentions on all communication frequencies. The response came from a Zephyrian commander who had survived the abandonment of his homeworld. His message was brief and filled with barely controlled anger at what humanity had done to his people. Morrison requested permission to meet with Coalition leaders to discuss the possibility of peaceful coexistence. After several tense hours of negotiations, he was granted safe passage to a neutral meeting point where representatives from 6 different species were waiting. The meeting took place aboard a hastily constructed space station that had been built without any human technology or design influence. Morrison found himself facing beings whose fear and anger were obvious despite their alien features. The Zephyrian representative spoke for the group, and his words cut deep into Morrison's conscience. The Coalition had evidence of humanity's unconscious predatory behavior that went back centuries. They had documented the extinction of species that Morrison had never even heard of. They knew about the manipulation and dependency relationships that humans created without realizing it. Most importantly, they had proof that the process was accelerating. Morrison listened to their accusations and felt the weight of collective human guilt settling on his shoulders. He tried to explain that humans had never intended to harm other species, but the Coalition representatives dismissed his words as meaningless. Intent did not matter when the results were genocide on a galactic scale, the Zephyrian commander presented Morrison with an ultimatum. Humanity had to withdraw from all disputed territories and accept restrictions on their expansion, or the Coalition would begin systematic attacks on human colonies. They would not allow their species to be slowly erased from existence. While humans claimed ignorance of their actions, Morrison realized that he was witnessing the beginning of a war that could destroy galactic civilization. The Coalition species were desperate and had nothing left to lose. They would fight to extinction rather than submit to gradual elimination through human manipulation. He transmitted the Coalition's demands back to Earth and waited for instructions. The response came from Admiral Carter himself, who had been monitoring the negotiations. Carter authorized Morrison to reveal Earth's new policy regarding alien species and their right to independent existence, Morrison explained. Dr. Torres's proposal for sanctuary worlds and managed coexistence. He described humanity's commitment to conscious oversight of their expansion and the acknowledgement of their unconscious predatory behavior. The coalition representatives listened with obvious skepticism to what sounded like another human manipulation attempt. The Zephyrin commander demanded proof that humanity was serious about these changes. Morrison transmitted detailed plans for the first Sanctuary World program and Earth's legislative proposals for restricting human expansion. The evidence was substantial, but the coalition needed time to study and verify the information. Back on Earth, the Galactic Council was convening an emergency session that would determine the future of interspecies relations. Representatives from dozens of alien civilizations had gathered to discuss growing evidence of humanity's unconscious predatory behavior. The debate threatened to tear apart galactic civilization as species chose sides. Some species that had become dependent on human systems defended humanity and argued that accusations of predatory behavior were exaggerated. Others presented evidence of cultural destruction and population decline that clearly pointed to human responsibility. The council chambers erupted in angry arguments that came close to physical violence. Admiral Carter took the unprecedented step of addressing the council on behalf of Earth's government. He stood before the assembled representatives and did something that no human leader had ever done before. He acknowledged humanity's unconscious predatory nature and accepted responsibility for the extinction of 17 alien species. The council chambers fell silent as Carter described the investigation that had revealed humanity's role as an apex predator, operating on a civilizational scale. He explained that humans had been unconsciously manipulating other species into dependency relationships that ultimately led to extinction or cultural destruction. Carter presented Earth's proposal for sanctuary worlds and managed coexistence. As humanity's attempt to break free from their destructive instincts, he acknowledged that these measures might not be enough and that stronger restrictions might be necessary to protect surviving species. The response was immediate and intense. Some species demanded that humanity be expelled from the galactic community and confined to their home system. Others argued that working together offered the best hope for preventing future extinctions. The debate continued for days as representatives struggled to find a solution that could prevent galactic war. The turning point came when the Morden refugees presented evidence that humanity's predatory behavior was not limited to direct contact. Human cultural influence was spreading through communication, networks, and trade relationships, even to species that had never met humans directly. The contamination was so widespread that complete isolation might be impossible. Dr. Torres addressed the council and proposed a radical alternative. Instead of trying to contain humanity, she suggested that other species needed to develop resistance to human influence. This would require understanding human psychology and creating cultural defenses against unconscious manipulation. The proposal was controversial because it required alien species to change their own behaviors rather than simply restricting human actions. But it offered hope for coexistence rather than the mutual destruction that seemed inevitable otherwise. The council reached a compromise agreement that satisfied no one completely but offered a path forward. Humanity would establish sanctuary worlds for species that wanted complete independence from human influence. Other species could choose to remain in the integrated galactic community but would receive training and support to resist unconscious human manipulation. Captain Morrison was promoted to admiral and given command of the Sanctuary World program. His first assignment was overseeing the establishment of a protected planet for young Voltae who had been rescued from Kepler 442c before their ecosystem completely collapsed. As Morrison watched the Voltae building their first settlements without any human guidance or influence, he reflected on humanity.